All right. Hello and welcome. This is our hermeneutics series where we're continuing to teach how to interpret the various genres of the Bible. And we've worked our way through the Old Testament, all the various genres in the Old Testament. And now we're going to start moving to the New Testament. So this month, as you have probably ascertained, we're going to be looking at the genre of Gospels. And then next month, we'll look at the Book of Acts. It's its own kind of genre. And then the month after that, we'll look at epistles, and then we'll look at the Apocalypse, the Book of Revelation, because it's its own type of literature. So some people might divide the New Testament into some subgenres, but I think for the purposes of what we're going to do, focusing on four Gospels, the history of the Book of Acts, epistles and letters, and then of course the Book of Revelation. I think that'll be sufficient for the study that we're doing. So we should be done with everything by the end of March at this rate. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay. All right. Um, if I'm not on full screen, someone tell me. But I think I'm at full screen. Let me drop myself down here a little bit. That's okay. All right. All right. So today we're looking at how to read New Testament Gospels. And as you can see in the background, we got four guys, four buddies. And that, of course, is referencing the four evangelists. It's a good way to refer to the authors of the four New Testament Gospels, that they're evangelists. So they are writing because they have a purpose to evangelize. So, a good question to ask when you're reading any sort of literature in the Bible is, what kind of literature is it? So, what is the literature of the New Testament gospel? The New Testament gospels closely resemble Greco-Roman biographies. Okay. And this is a common ancient form of biography that was available in the first century AD. There were lots of Greco-Roman biographies available in the first century and in the second century. And so we have a lot of literature to compare the Gospels to in order to understand the sort of literature that they were and the sort of expectations that the four Gospel writers, the evangelists, would have had for their initial readers. So Plutarch, who lived from the middle of the first century on into the second century, he wrote 48 biographies in Greek. 48 of these Greco-Roman biographies. So you can see he lived through the first century. He lived through the early church and many of the emperors in the first century. We're going to be drawing on one of them here, on one of Plutarch's biographies. If you wanted to get a copy of them, probably a lot of them are in public domain at this point, but some good translation. If you want a good translation of them, you want them from the Loeb Classical Library. So this one here has Demosthenes and Cicero, and then Alexander and Caesar. What Plutarch does is that he actually takes two of them and he compares and contrasts them. And this particular edition actually has the Greek alongside the English. So he wrote 48 of them, which is a lot. Here are some examples of some of the ones that he wrote about. He wrote about Pompey, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Cicero, Mark Antony, Brutus, Galba, and Otho. Many of those are emperors in their own right, at least particularly Galba and Otho. So you can see these are famous persons that these writers are taking the time to write biographies about. Suetonius, who also lived through the first century, but also on into the second century, he wrote 12 biographies in Latin. So we could see that Greco-Roman biographies appear in Greek and they also appear in Latin. And Suetonius, his 12 biographies are basically called the Lives of the Caesars. And so, starting with Julius Caesar, he worked his way through Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. So we can get a lot of our own history from these persons. So it's very interesting to kind of read them and to learn a lot about not only the lives of these famous persons, but also how ancient people would write biographies. So when you take the 48 biographies of Plutarch and the 12 biographies of Suetonius. Um, we actually can compare the New Testament gospel accounts to these 60 biographies, but the way that they would describe themselves, they would describe them as lives. That's what they would call them. The word biography is a combined English word that has two Greek words. The word bio has to do with life, and then the graphy has to do with the writing. So you're writing about someone's life. An autobiography actually has the pronoun there, which means self. It's you're writing a biography about yourself. So when we take these 60 biographies, these 60 lives, it becomes clear that the New Testament authors were not inventing a new literary genre. That's really, really important. Okay. But the New Testament writers were writing accounts of the life of Jesus in the common literary style of ancient biographies. When we compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to the works of Plutarch and Suetonius, I could, if I wanted to get up, I can go over there and grab a copy of Suetonius. When we compare them, we can see that the New Testament authors are deliberately writing within this particular literary genre. They're doing some new things uh, because, of course, they believe that their particular subject is still living right now because he's been raised from the dead. So that's something that's really distinct about them, but that's something that's distinct about Jesus when compared to every other human being. So when I say that the New Testament Gospels are biographies, we have to contrast them from modern biographies because when I tell people, when I tell students, when I tell freshman New Testament students that the Gospels are ancient biographies, they say, oh, okay, I know what a biography is because I've read biographies of Martin Luther King Jr. or biographies of Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill. But those are modern biographies, and there's some very specific differences between modern biographies and ancient biographies that we need to be aware of. Otherwise, we're just going to import our understanding of biographies into the New Testament. So, ancient biographies focus on the subject's public life. That's the key thing. It's the public life that the ancient biographies were concerned about. But modern biographies are interested in the subject's personal life and their private life. Okay, so we don't know much about Jesus's personal life and his private life, but we know a lot about his public life, his speeches, his sermons, his deeds, his miracles, the conversations that he had with him. You can see the Gospels are very much concerned with his public life. Okay, so if they don't tell us much about the personal and private life, it's not that the Gospel writers are leaving things out, it's that ancient biographies were not concerned about that. Ancient biographies purposefully stylized the subject as a particular character, like a holy man, a politician, a general, or a philosopher. And so you can think about the Gospels, in what way are they trying to portray Jesus? Well, they are portraying him as a holy man, but they're also portraying him as a king. So you kind of have like a general there is kind of similar to that politician. There might be some overlap of that with Jesus as well. But modern biographies, they actually try to give all sides of a character's personality. Okay, so you can already see the gospel writers are purposefully stylizing Jesus in order to fit a particular role. So characters in ancient biographies are static, meaning that they're unchanging in their character, but modern biographies tend to show how someone grows and they change their interest. So we could see that Jesus is going to be focused and he's going to be resolute. He's going to be an obedient son. He's going to be focused on what he needs to do in order to get to the cross. But he's not going to be changing his mind. He's not going to be wavering in his commitment because these ancient biographies are trying to portray someone who's kind of like an ideal holy man or an ideal politician or an ideal philosopher. Most importantly, probably the most important thing that I'm going to say today is that ancient biographies had the freedom to arrange their events topically or for a given purpose. So they had the freedom to take the contents and to organize them based on a particular topic or to provide a given purpose in their own writing. So the author's intended portrayal was far more important than strict chronological accuracy. I'm going to say that again. The intended portrayal of these ancient biographers, that was actually more important than to give a chronological accuracy. So whenever we're picking up Mark or John or Plutarch's Life of Alexander, we shouldn't expect that it's going to give us a strictly chronological account. That's not what they were intending to do. Now, it might portray things chronologically, but we shouldn't assume that automatically. We should actually assume that they're going to organize things in a way that uh, shows particular topics. But modern biographies pretend usually portray things chronologically. So, what I thought it would be good for us to do is to actually just open up and to look at the opening paragraph or the opening page of one of Plutarch's biographies, and you can get a sense as to the sort of things that he's saying and how they would compare to kind of the opening of one of our Gospels. Okay, so this is Plutarch's chapter 1, verse 1 of his Life of Alexander the Great. And so you got the Greek on the left and the English on the right. And so I'm just going to read from the English, and I might point out a couple of the Greek things. So Plutarch says, "It is the life of Alexander the king and of Caesar, who overthrew Pompey, that I'm writing in this book. And the multitude of the deeds to be treated is so great that I shall make no other preface than to entreat my readers, in case I do not tell of all the famous actions of these men, nor even to speak exhaustively at all in each particular case, but in epitome, for the most part, not to complain." Okay, so he's saying, look, I don't want you to complain, readers, because I can't tell you everything that these guys have done. I can't tell you everything that they've said. So he's like, just bear with me, okay? You know, don't complain. Okay, let's go on. For it's not histories that I'm writing, but lives. Okay, and that's an important distinction there. He's actually writing a biography, and in the Greek, it's the word vius, the word for biography. Okay, he said, I'm not writing to you a history book. I'm writing to you a life, a biography of this. And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice. Nay, a slight thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of character than battles where thousands fall or the greatest armaments or sieges of cities. So here he's saying that sometimes you can look at just the little things that someone says, like a small phrase, a small sentence, or a small jest, and you can learn a lot more about someone than these great deeds that they have done. And again, compare this to the Gospels, that they're very much focused on these little sayings of Jesus, these little beatitudes, or these little lines, or he's got these kind of witty comebacks with people, and we can learn a lot about that. Well, that's the sort of thing that would be focused on in these ancient biographies. Let's move on. Accordingly, just as painters get the likenesses in their portraits from the face and the expression of the eyes, wherein the character shows itself, but make very little account of other parts of the body, so I must be permitted to devote myself rather to the signs of the soul in men, and by means of these to portray the life of each, leaving to others the description of their great contest. So he's telling you, he's like, look, when someone's painting a picture, they don't give, head to toe. They just focus on the face and the things that are important. And he's like, in the same way, I'm going to focus on the things that are important, and I'm going to leave all the other details to other people. So we can already see that these ancient writers, they're selective. They're focused on the things that are really important. They're not being exhaustive, and they're deliberately not telling you a boring history account. They're telling you the life of this particular person. Okay? It's intentional, it's stylized, and he's deliberately writing to his readers in a way that he wants the readers to understand where he's coming from. Okay? He assumes that his readers are going to understand what he's saying. And then when he moves out of his preface, he says, as for the lineage of Alexander, on his father's side, he was a descendant of Heracles through Chironus, and on his mother's side, a descendant of Acus through Neoptolemus. This is accepted without any question. And we are told that Philip is his father, where the city of Philippi, by the way, is named after Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. So you can see he starts off with this kind of a genealogy, just like we see in Matthew and in Luke. Okay, so I think we can get a lot out of that. Again, this is a biography. It's very similar to what we have in our New Testament. Okay, so let's talk about themes and purposes that are found in our ancient biographies and in the Gospels. Okay, so the first theme that we're going to see is that they are intended to praise someone as noteworthy or to blame someone as undesirable. Okay, so we've already seen in the list of the various persons that had ancient first century biographies written about them is that you can have positive people like some of the Roman emperors. Let's just say Augustus, one of the most famous Roman emperors in the first century. So they would praise him, but Brutus, one of the persons that assassinated Julius Caesar, they're not writing a biography to praise him. They're going to write a biography to blame him as someone who is undesirable. Okay, so when we think of the New Testament Gospels, are they trying to praise him as someone who's noteworthy, or are they trying to blame him as someone who's undesirable? Well, clearly, the four New Testament Gospels are trying to portray Jesus as someone who is noteworthy. So ancient biographies, they were never neutral in the presentation of their facts. Okay, it's either a positive spin or a negative spin. Okay, number two, to use the subject as a model for teaching purposes, focusing on what type of behavior is good or bad. So again, Augustus has all of this virtue. He has this sort of patriotism, this sort of love for country, this desire to not force his rule over a lot of people. So they would write biographies about him in order to use him as a positive teaching model. But someone like Brutus, who was treacherous, who was someone that's untrustworthy, that's the kind of behavior that's not good. Okay. And so the focus really had more to do with the response of the reader than it actually had to do with their portrayal of history. So again, these writers are trying to get the readers to look at the subject as a model to either emulate or someone to avoid acting like that person. So when it comes to the New Testament gospel accounts, the depiction of Jesus aims to place his behavior. What did Jesus do? Well, he obeyed the will of God. He was an obedient son. So that sort of behavior is the behavior that the readers are supposed to pursue. The writers are writing the gospels deliberately to portray Jesus as a model to emulate. They're meant to be obeyed. They're meant to be read and put into practice in their life, which is why the whole idea of dispensationalism, which says that the Gospels aren't really for Christians, or some people saying the Gospels belong in the Old Testament, they're just completely ripping the Gospels out of their own literary and genre context. So Jesus is an example for the readers who presumably are disciples of Jesus or interested in becoming disciples. Most people aren't just going to pick up Gospels in the first century because they have no idea what it is. They're reading it because they're being copied in churches and they're being used by Christians for Christians. Number three, the purposes of ancient biographies were to persuade the reader to think and to behave in certain ways. And number four, they were to highlight the actions and words of a particular figure in deliberate contrast with another person, another group, or another sect. Okay? So, again, if they're writing a biography about Julius Caesar, they're going to contrast him from his murderer, Brutus. Brutus and Cassius, by the way. So when it comes to the New Testament Gospels, we could think, okay, are they trying to portray Jesus as a particular figure that is contrasted with other figures, other persons or groups or sects? Sometimes it's pretty easy to see this. Okay, so the Pharisees are a group or a sect that the author of Matthew is trying to get you to not listen to. Let's compare and contrast Jesus with the Pharisees. That's a deliberate contrast you can see in the Gospel of Matthew. That's very intentional, and it actually reflects on the sort of message that Matthew wants to give to his original readers, to his original audience. And of course, the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, in the Gospel of John, they are very clearly the antagonistic group or sect that doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but Jesus is constantly claiming to be the Jewish Messiah. So this is an underrated point, but it's really important for seeing that the writer of the four New Testament Gospels, for each individual writer, when they're contrasting Jesus from these other groups, they want you to look at Jesus and his words and his deeds and to believe and act like them, but also to see that when Jesus disagrees with people, that the readers should also adopt that same view. So the portrayal of Jesus arguing with another person, another group, or another sect is meant to be something that is taken seriously by the original readers. Okay. Now, I mentioned that the writers of ancient biographies had the freedom to arrange their material thematically. So, one place in particular that I'm actually going to try to give some examples from all four Gospels to show you how they do this. Okay. So, here's an interesting example in Mark chapter 8, verse 22. I'll put my glasses on here. Okay. They came to Bethsaida and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on the eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I see them like trees walking around." Then again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and he began to see everything clearly. Okay? So, what's going on here? This is what is called a two-stage healing. A two-stage healing. So, Jesus actually heals this guy partially, and then he heals him fully. So, the first time that he heals him, he just, let's see, um, he spits on his eyes and he lays his hand on him. Okay, something by the way that I would not encourage people to do today. um, but you can see that the sort of seeing that the blind man is able to do after the first part of the healing, it's partial. He's like, I could see men, but they look like trees. Okay, it's like he can see something. It's better than being blind. He actually can see things, but he can't see fully. And then Jesus laid his hands, and he's able to see intently, and he was restored. And then the author says that the blind man began to see everything clearly. Okay, so that is a two-stage healing. Okay, to where the first part is not enough, but Jesus actually does the second part. But notice it has to do with somebody being able to see and to perceive the world correctly. Okay, now what comes right after this is what I think another two-stage healing, to where there's a first part and the second part is something that's full. So notice what comes right after this. So that's Mark 8:22 through 25. And then if you keep on reading, look what we have here, starting at 8:27. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Okay? And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and in 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay? So if you just read this story right here, I don't think you would understand what's actually taking place. But if you had the previous story, you can actually see what Mark is doing. So notice what's going on here. Jesus is asking, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." Okay? That's good. Okay? That's true. Okay? However, just acknowledging that Jesus is the anointed king of God's kingdom is not enough. Because Jesus also wants them to believe that the king of the kingdom of God is someone that's going to be a rejected figure, a suffering figure, someone who's going to die, and someone who's going to be raised from the dead. Now, Peter gets the first part. But the second part, what does Peter do? Does he understand it? Does he see clearly? No, he doesn't. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So you see what's going on here? We can see that there's a two-stage Christology that's going on here. The first part, Peter's able to see. The second part, he's not able to see, which is interesting because in the previous story, you've got a blind man who was only able to see partially. He was able to see, but he was only able to see partially, and then he was able to see fully. So Jesus, when he's teaching them, notice what he's doing. His teaching is opening the eyes of their understanding. I think Jesus teaching this to them is a healing story, and it's able. What he's trying to do is he's trying to get the readers, not just the readers, but also the disciples, to see clearly who he is. Yes, it's true that Jesus is the Christ, but that's only part of it. If you only understand Jesus to be the Christ, then you see a little bit, but you don't see clearly. But when Jesus is able to say the Christ is going to be a rejected figure, and it says Jesus was stating the matter plainly, clearly, so they can see it. He was saying it to them. And then, of course, Peter, the person who's able to see the first part, is not able to see the second part. That's a two-stage healing. But the healing is Jesus teaching them the truth about who he is and about Christology. But if you only read that part there in Mark chapter 8, 27 through 32, and you didn't read the previous part, I don't think you would connect what's going on. So this is an underrated way in which Mark wants you to read the story about who do you say that I am right after the story of the two-stage healing, so that you can see that Jesus teaching about his own Christology is a story about healing. It's two stages, and that the first part is not enough. You need the second part as well. And Peter is not able to see as much as the blind guy that was just previously healed, which kind of gives a little bit of irony. Okay, but you can see Mark is deliberately organizing his material to say that. Because the first part is like, hey, here's one city. They went to Bethsaida. Here's the second part where they went to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Mark organized this in a way so that you read the second story in light of the first story. That's why they're one after another. Okay. All right. Let's look at Matthew. Matthew, he likes to gather certain types of teachings into blocks. Okay. So Matthew has 5 blocks because he's trying to portray Jesus as the new Moses. Moses, of course, had 5 books that are attributed to him: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So in order to portray Jesus as the new Moses, you got to have 5 blocks of teaching. And so Matthew will say, okay, well, the Sermon on the Mount, that's going to be one block. Gathering all the healings and miracles in chapters 8 through 9, that's another block. Instructions for missionaries and evangelists, that's chapter 10. 7 different parables of the kingdom, that's in chapter 13. And then discourses on the second coming and the judgment, that's in chapters 24 through 25. But Matthew, he just he puts them all together. And if you're reading through it, if you think it's chronological, you might get the impression that Jesus did all of his healings in one day. Then he did all of his miracles in another day. And then he gave parables of the kingdom all in one day. And then he talked about the second coming all in one day. But that's just Matthew organizing intentionally his material so that you can see this Christological portrayal of Jesus as the new Moses. He's not trying to give you something that's strictly chronological. He's more interested in portraying things topically. Luke knows that his gospel, the Gospel of Luke, is the first of a 2-volume set, Luke and the book of Acts. And so Luke is going to write things in Luke knowing that it's going to set up things in the book of Acts. So I'm going to show you how this works, okay? So in Luke chapter 21, verse 27, Jesus says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud, singular, coming in a cloud with power and great glory, okay? But in Mark's version, in Mark chapter 13, verse 26, it says clouds, coming in clouds. There shouldn't be an apostrophe there. But so why did Luke change Mark? Because Luke used Mark as a source. Why did Luke take Mark, which had a plural clouds, and then change it to a singular? Why would he do that? Well, it's because he's anticipating something that's going to happen in the book of Acts. So look here in Acts chapter 1 about the ascension and the second coming. In Acts chapter 1, verse 9, and after he had said these things, he was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud, singular, received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky, While he was going, behold, two men in white clothing stood before them, and they said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven. Okay? So the ascension has Jesus being taken up in a single cloud. And so Luke is going to say the Son of Man is going to come back in a single cloud because the angels had showed up and said Jesus is going to return in the same way that he came. Okay. So people have asked, why is it that sometimes Luke and Matthew are a little bit different than Mark? I think you have to ask the question, why did those authors feel the need to change that? And here's one of these things to where Luke is deliberately arranging his material because he had Mark as a source. He's deliberately arranging his stuff in the Gospel of Luke because he wants to set up things in the book of Acts. And there are a variety of times that actually happens. So um, they're the kind of thing that you have to be like really insightful to see. But I'm just giving you one example here that I think is kind of interesting. Okay, so we've looked at Mark, we've looked at Matthew, we've looked at Luke. What about John? Well, John is going to arrange his discourses in terms of someone who is regularly misunderstood. So there's a theme in the Gospel of John called the theme of misunderstanding. It appears roughly 18 times. That's a lot for a 21 chapter book. And so this is how the theme of misunderstanding appears in the Gospel of John. Number one, Jesus is going to make an ambiguous statement. Number two, the conversation partner, whether it's an opponent of Jesus or whether it's one of the disciples, they're going to misunderstand what Jesus just said. And they're going to misunderstand it specifically by either interpreting it literally or by asking an inappropriate question. And the third part is that either Jesus or the narrator explains the statement, although sometimes this is just missing because it's just obviously implied. So where does this appear? Well, I'll give you the first example. The first example to see this is in John chapter 2, where Jesus is cleansing the temple. And again, a lot of people have said, well, the cleansing of the temple happens at the beginning of the ministry in the Gospel of John, but it happens at the end of the ministry in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we've wondered, how do you reconcile that? Some people have said, well, you now have to have two cleansing of the temples. But I think this is missing the point because we've already learned that the gospel writers had the freedom to rearrange their sources. And so John is going to take the event that happened at the end of his ministry and he's going to place it at the beginning of his gospel because he wants to contrast Jesus from the temple in a variety of interesting ways. So we shouldn't assume that just because Jesus cleansed the temple at the beginning of the Gospel of John, that's something that happened at the beginning of his ministry. That's to assume that these writers are writing with chronological strictness. They're not. They're arranging their sources thematically and purposefully. So in this one right here, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's the first part. So Jesus is going to make an ambiguous statement. Destroy this temple, in 3 days I'm going to raise it up. Okay? His dialogue partner, his conversation partner, here it's the Jews, they said, it took 46 years to build the temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days? Okay? So what do? They've misunderstood him by interpreting him literally. Okay? And you see the narrator jumps in, gives you the third part, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Okay, so this is the very first time that we have the theme of misunderstanding in the Gospel of John. It's very clear to see. You can see step one, Jesus says the statement. Step two, he's misunderstood by being interpreted too literally. Step three, the narrator comes in and explains what Jesus meant. Okay, and what do you see? You see that Jesus is seeing himself as the new temple. That's something that the Gospel of John wants to show you right from the beginning, which is why I think he is placing the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of his gospel when it almost certainly happened a few days before Jesus' crucifixion. Okay, so a lot of these things hopefully are helping you to kind of put some pieces together. Maybe you already knew all these things. I'm not sure, but hopefully this will be helpful to some people. Okay, so how should we read the New Testament Gospels? I think this is my last slide. Yes. Okay. Last slide. Okay. So, how should we read the New Testament Gospels? What are some tips for you to walk away with so that you could be equipped to read these Gospels as responsible interpreters of history and inform people by ancient Greco-Roman biographies? Number one, God gave the church four accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus. So we should respect that decision and not try to blend the four into a single version of the story. What do I mean by this? We shouldn't take all four gospels and just say, well, let's just kind of like put them all together and try to harmonize everything so that we actually have one story. But God didn't give you one story. God didn't give the church one gospel. If he wanted to, he could have done that, but he didn't. He allowed there to be four gospels. I think he influenced these authors to write four gospels, and these gospels were preserved and they were collected together into our sacred collection of scripture. And so we should respect the fact that God has allowed there to be four different accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. And so we need to read them as four separate accounts and not combine them all together. So that's the thing, is the first thing in reading for the New Testament Gospels is to read and respect each of them individually. Don't try to clam them all together and put them into a blender and then, pour it out into, one single story. Right? Number two, each evangelist has a unique message written from his perspective to serve, build up, and encourage the needs of his community of faith. Since each church community has different needs, we should aim to discern how each New Testament gospel is organizing its life of Jesus to meet those specific needs. So when we read the Gospel of Mark, we can say, okay, how is it arranging its material? What can we determine about the intended audience and their social situation, their religious situation, their political situation? And we can get a lot out of that. We can actually find a lot of interesting details in Mark that will tell us about that, because the author is writing intentionally for the readers that he knows so that he can encourage them. We need to ask that sort of question. But that's a very different sort of circumstances than the initial readers of the Gospel of John who are being kicked out of the synagogue. That's not happening there in the Markan community of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, they have unique messages. They're written from each of the evangelists' unique perspectives for the specific needs of their individual communities. Luke is writing to Theophilus. Matthew's not writing to Theophilus. Again, we have to interpret each of these individually. We need to respect the fact that they're individual authors that have been individually inspired, all by the same God, and they're all talking about the same Jesus, but they're writing for different purposes, for different audiences, at different times, with different needs that need to be filled. Number three, since the New Testament Gospels follow the literary convention of intentionally portraying their subjects as someone to follow and imitate, we should value theology and practical application more than the details of chronology and history. Again, if the purpose of the Gospels is to intentionally shape and portray their subject as someone that is either praiseworthy or blameworthy, then we should read them and we should be asking the question, what is the theology I'm supposed to be getting from this particular person? What is the practical application I should be getting from this person? How am I supposed to look at this person's life and their words and this person's deeds? And how am I supposed to apply them? Let me see if I can do that. Okay, I think I might be good now. All right. Sorry about all that. Sorry about that. Okay. Um, yeah. So since the gospel writers are intentionally trying to portray Jesus as someone they're supposed to imitate, then the theology and the practical application, that's far more important than the details of history and chronology. Now, you can get chronology and history out of these works, but the writers are not intentionally trying to give you that, at least from the purpose of the literary genre. Remember Plutarch writing about Alexander? He says, I'm not writing to you history, I'm writing to you a biography right now. So we have to respect the Gospels for what they are, and we have to draw out of them what the writers were trying to give to their original audiences and not try to extract things that they were never trying to tell the readers in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now and appreciate you for watching. Got any questions? Let us know and I'll be happy to help you. Hopefully, this has been beneficial. Thanks for watching and take care. Let's see.